Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the very first Long Island Sound Coastal Watershed Network webinar of 2024. My name is Holly Drinketh, and I'm the Director of River and Estuary Conservation for the Nature Conservancy in Connecticut. Not only is this our first webinar event of 2024, we're kicking off our fourth year. This is the fourth year that the Nature Conservancy, Citizens Campaign for the Environment, and Save the Sound have worked together to facilitate this coastal watershed network. And just as a little background, we started this network back in 2020 with a generous grant from the Long Island Sound Funders Collaborative. And that was intended to help us build a collaborative network of communities and groups working to target and tackle pollution from nitrogen, fecal bacteria, and plastics generated by activities on land. We're thrilled to announce today that we recently received an award through the Long Island Sound Futures Fund to continue the Coastal Watershed Network activities for the next 2 years. And we're very grateful to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Environmental Protection Agency for this funding, which is allowing our organizations to continue providing news and information through our regular newsletters and offer webinars like this that feature local projects and technical experts like we'll see today. And we're super excited in the coming year to host some dialogues that dig deeper on water quality issues, promote more projects that tackle water pollution, and convene the next in-person Long Island Sound Network Summit in 2025. So please help us to spread the word and continue building the network and bringing in more members focused on clean water in Long Island Sound. Today, we have a great lineup of webinar speakers that are going to feature the challenge of nitrogen pollution, and more specifically, nitrogen from lawn fertilizers. And it's really important for us to note that nitrogen pollution is not just a Long Island Sound problem, it's a global problem. 5 years ago, the United Nations Environment Program called nitrogen pollution one of the most important issues facing humanity. It's an abundant element, nitrogen, and we really need it. It's in our Earth's atmosphere. It helps make our sky blue, and it makes up the proteins in our body. However, when we have too much nitrogen in the environment from wastewater, fertilizers, or the combination of fossil fuels, or combustion of fossil fuels, it's a hazard that pollutes our land, our water, and our air. It exacerbates climate change, and it depletes the ozone layer. This image helps to illustrate how nitrogen pollution is entering groundwater, streams, and Long Island Sound, and it can set off a cascade of problems. Too much nitrogen in coastal waters can trigger rampant growth of algae that reduce water clarity and prevent sunlight from reaching seagrasses, which is one of the topics that we'll be focusing on today. When algae die, they sink to the seafloor and decompose and use up oxygen. They can create dead zones in the water where fish and other marine life can't survive. Some algae even produce neurotoxins that contaminate shellfish. Excess nitrogen can also cause overgrowth of nuisance seaweeds that smother seagrass, wash up on beaches, or coat the seafloor with dense decaying layers of muck. And as I mentioned, United Nations Environmental Program sees nitrogen pollution as the third most influential global driver of human-made biodiversity decline after habitat destruction and the emission of greenhouse gases. December of 22, a landmark global agreement to safeguard biodiversity set targets to reduce pollution from sources so that by 2030, pollutants will not be harmful to life and ecosystems. The great news is that in Long Island Sound, we know how to address nitrogen pollution, and we've done it before. Now, we've already reduced discharge from nitrogen in sewage treatment plants by 40 million pounds a year, and it has made a difference. We've got increased oxygen reaching our bottom waters in the open sound. Now is the time that we need to turn our attention to the coastal bays where we're still experiencing algal blooms that threaten our ecosystem, put public health at risk, and disrupt enjoyment of our beaches and waters. But that's not easy to do, and that's why we are focused on local pollution and tackling those sources so we can make the link between what people do on land and how it impacts our coastal waters. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to ask Jordan to put up a poll. We're looking for you to participate in sharing what you think are some of the primary causes or some of the primary actions we can take to address local nitrogen pollution. Following the presentation, Peter Linderoth, Director of Water Quality for Save the Sound, will be facilitating a speaker discussion. And we really want these webinars and activities to be a place that sparks new ideas and new connections. So we encourage you all to share your questions and comments in the chat during the presentation. That will help us all learn from each other and commit to new actions to tackle water pollution challenges in Long Island Sound. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Jamie Vaudrey. Jamie is a marine ecosystem ecologist interested in the impacts of humans on coastal waters. She's currently serving as the research coordinator for the Connecticut National Estuarine Research Reserve. She's also a member of the Science Advisory Committees of the Long Island Sound Study and the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program. Jamie advises multiple local community-based monitoring programs, and she's the science co-advisor for Save the Sound's Unified Water Study and Long Island Sound report card efforts. Jamie's research shows us that fertilizer accounts for about 20% of the total nitrogen load to Long Island Sound, not including New York City, correct, Jamie? And today, she's going to focus on how understanding fertilizer hotspots is critical to targeting behavior change campaigns intended to reduce this source of pollution. Next up, we'll hear from Hannah Vagts, the project coordinator for Henry L. Ferguson Museum's Fisher's Island Seagrass Management Coalition. Hannah uses her experience in marine coastal habitats to lead the coalition's Save Our Seagrass movement, which includes boating and landscaping initiatives. Hannah will share highlights of the coalition's project that encourages Fisher's Island residents to plant native and use fertilizer alternatives. And finally, we'll round it out with Adrienne Esposito, Executive Director of Citizens Campaign for the Environment, who will highlight examples of municipal projects to reduce nitrogen, share how nitrogen fertilizer alternatives made it to market, and give us some individual actions residents can take to reduce fertilizer use on their lawns. So with that, I will pass it over to Jamie Vaudrey to get us started on the talk.
All right, thank you, Holly. You can skip right through that slide. Thank you. So I wanted to start off our day today by talking about water quality in general. Because really, when we're talking about nitrogen reduction, we're talking about nitrogen reduction with the end goal of improving water quality in our bays and harbors, Long Island Sound, and our coastal zone in general. Hannah is going to be talking a bit about seagrass, one of our favorite plants, and that's what's pictured here. We see seagrass or eelgrass specifically for us here in Long Island Sound. That's our species. We see eelgrass in areas where the water quality and the habitat quality is good. And really, it's one of those indicators of a healthy system and what we aspire to. But what challenges our water quality, and you can go to the next slide, Holly, is the fertilizer and other forms of nutrients that we put into the environment. Today, we're focusing on fertilizer specifically, but of course, human waste, either through septic and sewer delivery, or atmospheric deposition delivering nitrogen from fossil fuel sources, are also big contributors in Long Island Sound. But fertilizer is what we're talking about. Now, just as Holly was mentioning that nitrogen is something that we need to live, too much is it can be a good thing. The same applies to fertilizer. We fertilize our plants, our vegetables, our lawns, because we want to encourage plant growth. But when we over fertilize and that fertilizer runs off to the coastal zone, it is also fertilizing that coastal waters. Next slide. So we go from that like happy eelgrass and clean waters to eelgrass that is now having to deal with seaweed that is being over fertilized, growing abundantly. I love this photo because to me it looks like a little bouquet of different seaweeds, and they are lovely. They're an important part of our habitat, but when we over fertilize them, they really can overshadow an environment and start to create environmental problems. Next slide. So the work that I'm going to touch on today, one more back, the acknowledgements. The work that I'm going to touch on today is really based on 3 previous projects. NSYNC, which was the folks at Clear, Yukon Clear, the nitrogen loading model, which were folks at Cornell Cooperative Extension and my team at Yukon, and then residential fertilizer use survey conducted by Robert Johnston, Dave Newbern, and a whole host of other people. So these were 3 projects that really got at different aspects of nitrogen and its impact in the environment. NSYNC looked at the sinks of nitrogen, or how leaky our watershed was to nitrogen. So they said, okay, in a watershed, what areas are going to hold on to the nitrogen and what areas are going to let that nitrogen flow through to the estuary. The nitrogen loading model looked at, how are we living on the land and how much of the nitrogen that we're contributing as humans makes it down to the estuary. And then the residential fertilizer use really started to dig into something that we didn't know very well at all, which was how much fertilizer are people applying to their lawns, how often, where, and when. When Rob and his team, they released their results on residential fertilizer use in Long Island Sound, one of the big questions was, hey, that's great, but why not combine it with these other models so that we can better understand how nitrogen is behaving in our environment, and so we can better target our mitigation strategies to be most effective. So that's really what led to this current project. Next slide. But I wanted to put that in a little bit of context here. So Holly mentioned that that we have achieved our nitrogen reduction goal that was set back in 1998. That nitrogen reduction goal was achieved in 2017. But we knew going into this that wasn't going to be enough. We set a goal, we achieved it, but already midway or even before we even got started at reducing that nitrogen, we knew that it wasn't going to be enough. And part of that comes back to this population trend that we have going on this planet. We are increasing our population. And so while we are reducing nitrogen, we're increasing the number of people that are continuing to contribute nitrogen to the environment. This is a plot of New York City's population from 1756 to 2020, and I'm using it as a proxy for the population in Long Island Sound. I want to point out that in 1930, in the early 1930s, we had a die-off of eelgrass that occurred across the North Atlantic. We lost over 95% of our eelgrass due to a virus, due to an epidemic that impacted that eelgrass. Eelgrass never fully recovered because it happened at a time when population was high and nutrient loading was high. So eelgrass was struggling against these water quality issues to recolonize. As we move forward in time, we start to realize the error of our ways. We start to reduce nitrogen, and then we come to our present day where we're still focused on improving our nitrogen or reducing our nitrogen loads to improve our water quality so that we can support habitats like eelgrass and oyster reefs and healthy seaweed beds. But again, we are struggling against our continual increase in population. Next slide. So to help address this, we want to attack nitrogen loading from many directions. We want to attack all of our sources and try to really reduce the nitrogen loading that we are putting into Long Island Sound. This is a map that came out of the fertilizer work, so the fertilizer survey work. And this is showing using kind of a color map. So red are areas where fertilizer is being applied more heavily to lawns. And then the greens and blues are areas where fertilizer is being applied at a much lower rate to our landscape. With white being areas that don't have fertilizer necessarily. There are forested areas or our cities, our impervious cover where we're not applying fertilizer to asphalt. So this study really helped us look at the patterns in how people were fertilizing so that we could predict throughout the whole Long Island Sound watershed where that heavy fertilization to lawns was occurring. Next slide. The next slide is from the NSYNC model. And I mentioned that the NSYNC looks at where nitrogen is being retained on the land and where our landscape is leaky to nitrogen, where it's letting nitrogen flow down to the sound. So if you see areas of red on this map, it tells you that if you apply nitrogen to that area, almost 90 to 100% of that nitrogen is going to make it down to Long Island Sound. If you apply nitrogen to an area that's blue, less than 10% of that nitrogen is going to make it down to Long Island Sound. Next slide. So if we combine those two maps, we now have an updated map of where fertilizer use, where we can target our education campaigns and have the most impact. So if you see areas that are red here, it's a combination of that fertilizer load and usually in a leaky area or an area where we have a lot of nitrogen reaching the sound. And so it lets us know where we can focus on reducing our fertilizer applications. Next slide. And all of that feeds into community-based social marketing campaigns. I won't say much about this as I think Adrian's going to talk a little bit about this outreach and education piece. But the Long Island Sound study has a website which highlights some of these fertilizer campaigns and other social-based campaigns. The one pictured here was led by the Long Island Sound Study and the Niantic River Watershed Committee, and they went out into communities to try and get people to change their behaviors and reduce that fertilizer use. So I'll wrap up just by saying that what I shared today were preliminary results. We should have final results coming out in early 2025, and I'm sure I'll be talking to you all more about that in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And I'll pass this over to Hannah. Hannah, you're going to share your slides, right? We'll get started. And I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Gotta unmute myself.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, I am super excited to be talking to you all today about how the Island Seagrass Management Coalition encourages homeowners and residents to engage in planting native and reducing their fertilizer use. So we focused on fertilizer because excess nitrogen in marine environments is linked to eelgrass death. Now, Jamie just covered that really well, so I won't repeat her. But we found from a study from the Woods Hole Group in 2014 that homeowners were a significant source of nitrogen pollution in Fisher's Island waters. Now, some of that was from septic and cesspool systems leaking nitrogen, but the rest of that contribution was from residential fertilizer. So Fisher's Island residents, they have this growing understanding that native plants are good and fertilizer is bad, but this is generally understood in the context for what it does for the terrestrial environment. So we wanted to encourage the community to understand the connection between our actions on land and the effects in the water. And furthermore, we wanted to inspire more than just understanding. We wanted to inspire action. So we created a list of comprehensive small and large actions that community members could engage in. Now, the composition of the FISM Coalition is so important to how we accomplish our goals. Community involvement drives and inspires us. The coalition comprises seasonal and year-round residents representing stakeholder groups around the island. During the development of our initiatives, they bring their unique perspectives to our group discussions. And once we have our messaging developed, they bring that message to their community groups. This year, they wrote 475 letters to their neighbors, friends, and members of their stakeholder groups to bring our fertilizer reduction initiatives and actions directly to the community. Our partnership with the Nature Conservancy was also crucial to helping us develop and accurately target our audience. And we had an excellent graphic design and branding team that created professional materials for our social media, website, and handouts. Our project was funded by the Long Island Sound Futures Fund, which helped us hold the meetings and develop the content for the initiative, and by the Long Island Sound Stewardship Fund, which hired the graphic design and branding team that we needed. So this infographic is one of my favorite things that we created because it clearly demonstrates that cause and effect of homeowners on land and nitrogen pollution in the water. And it's been really crucial for engaging community members and understanding their impact on water quality. You'll also note that we used words like nitrogen pollution, not eutrophication, and we used cause and effect type language rather than watershed. We found that while both communicate our messaging, the more technical words require definitions and explanations that can stunt the conversation and bring it off topic. We also created this responsible fertilizing flyer that outlines what homeowners can do to reduce their fertilizer impact. This flyer is really geared towards the community member who has an idea that fertilizer isn't the best thing that they could be doing, but isn't sure where to start changing that behavior. So our flyer starts with talking about timings to ensure that any application a community member does is done when plants can actually use it. And then we move on to recommending natural alternatives to some chemical fertilizers that they might be using. And one of our suggestions is to grow their lawn 4 to 5 inches tall, which is why we have that ruler on the side of the flyer so that it can help with the visualization and maybe they can even check how it looks in their own lawn. And then we finish with a recommendation to just use less of the fertilizer that they're already using, if nothing else, because it is likely overused in most lawns and gardens anyway. And then on the right there is our cocktail napkin we created for homeowners to share their support of our initiatives. This came as a result of Fishers Islanders not really liking lawn signage of any kind, but we still wanted to create a way for homeowners to demonstrate their support that wouldn't be obtrusive or objectionable. So we had the idea that cocktail parties are super popular on the island, and maybe this could be a way for them to show their support. And it actually turned out to be a pretty A+ idea. Now, the most surprising thing that we learned through this project was how crucial the branding process was to our successful engagement with the community. The color and style of our designs and on our materials started building community recognition. Because we could look the same without looking repetitive, community members would regularly engage with our new materials. And the professional, well thought out materials also added a sense of credibility and authority to our work. But most importantly, for me, was the tonal exercises and how they helped us identify words and phrases that were more distracting than helpful when speaking on our initiatives. An example of this would be educate and teach. While these are perfect descriptions of what we would like to do, we found that they also cause people to put up walls. In certain contexts, they can sound a little judgmental or preachy, which is absolutely not what we're trying to do. So we learned to use words like explore, journey, discover. And those words worked a lot better to engage community members in our messaging. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions. If you'd like to chat, my email is on the slide. We're also on Instagram. Our website is a fun place to be, and that QR code will take you directly to our gallery of fertilizer reduction exploration materials we used for this project. Thanks. And I'll hand it over to Adrienne now.
Welcome. I'm the last speaker. So we're going to talk just a little bit about what do we do? What are some other practical things that we can do? And we have some suggestions for you. Next slide. There we go. Next slide. Everyone knows that the excessive fertilizer is what runs off into our waterways. And so we did a survey in 2018 with Citizens Campaign for the Environment and Cornell, or as we affectionately call them, the other CCE. And we surveyed about 200 people who were on Long Island and lived on the Sound. And okay, Maureen's trigger happy there with the slides. Lived on the Sound. We have so we surveyed about 200 people. And it was interesting because about 200 of them responded. And out of that, you can see from these slides here, we have 25% said that they use fertilizers. I'm sorry, that they use pesticides, which we thought was a little low, but we didn't know if they were afraid that, because we were asking the questions. But still, that's still great. Only 25%. But out of that, the fertilizers on the lawn, people still used it at almost 60%. It's 59% there. So that really tells us that people kind of are getting the message that the pesticides will run off into the water body, and those are toxic chemicals. They're man-made. They're not good for us. But, and that's true. But fertilizer, people still see as a natural product. Pesticides, we could use the example of neonicotinoids. We know that they kill everything from honeybees to other pollinators. So people really have reduced the amount that they're using. But fertilizer is still something natural, right? It's nitrogen, it's phosphorus. So there's still an abundant use of that. Next slide. So some laws have gone into effect. Suffolk County, you may be aware, was on the cutting edge. They passed a law in 2007, which simply bans fertilizer use when the ground is frozen. Now, that might sound perfectly common sense to you, but we are finding that sometimes people get out there late in November and they were fertilizing, and less was being absorbed by the ground, and more is being put into the water body that, whatever the watershed was. So this bans the application, not the sale, but the application of fertilizer from November 1st to April 1st. It also requires, we're not sure this is really enforced, but it requires the stores put up a sign and notify customers. So it's usually either at the point of sale where the fertilizer is, or they could do it at the register. And the county provided some of those signs and brochures to the stores. Nassau County passed their own law, but they had to make it a little different just to make it confusing. So instead of starting on November 1st, they decided to start on November 15th. So they also require public notification, but I will tell you guys, we didn't put a slide on this. We actually did a survey of approximately 30 stores in Suffolk County many years ago. We did site visits to see if the signs were up and to see if the brochures were there and to see if the notification was there. And it was a pretty dismal result. So the law really needs to be maintained. It needs to be pursued on the part of each of the county to make sure that the notification is being placed sufficiently and adequately at the point of sale or at the register. New York State followed, as they do when Nassau and Suffolk County lead. They also had to make the date a little bit different. So New York State law is December 1st to April 1st. Next slide. Okay, so now we got some laws passed. What could we do on a very local level? Well, we worked with the Village of Northport and also stakeholders, including the Northport Yacht Club, because we took Northport Harbor as kind of a case study. And the reason for that is not good news, but because Northport Harbor has really had an outbreak of red tide in the past. At the time, it was the largest cell density of red tide of any place in the world, of over 1 million red tide cells per liter of water, which is not a claim to fame you want. Sometimes you want to be the best or you want to be the first at things, but not in the density of red tide cells. Red tides, for those of you who don't know, is a saxitoxin, which means it's pretty darn poisonous. It can cause paralysis or death if you eat shellfish tainted with red tide. And those incidents have happened in areas such as Alaska. So we really worked hard to tackle the nitrogen loading into Northport Harbor. And one of those is the collaboration that's still ongoing. Next slide. So here's one of the rain garden projects. This slide, just so you can get oriented, the blue there is the road. It's not a water body. And then the green on your left side are the rain gardens that were constructed. And then right after that is a large parking lot for the yacht club. And what was happening is the water was running down that road. There was no vegetation there except a little bit of a kind of lawn way along the road there. But it was going right into the road, right into the parking lot, and then right into the harbor, which is right off the parking lot there. Unfiltered, there's a bit of a hill there. So the water was actually rushing down into the parking lot and then off into the Northport Harbor, completely unfiltered. Next slide. So this is a good visual here. You can see that there's no buffer at all, and it would just run off. Keep going. Then this is a wonderful slide of community in action. You can see us all planting there. It was a lot of volunteer work, I have to say, but really great effort on the part of the Northport community folks. Next slide. And look how pretty. Look what a great job we all did there. And actually, I have to say, it did come really, really good. And we did use a professional rain garden, Rusty Schmidt, and he did a wonderful job. He laid it all out for us, but then everybody came together and did the digging and the planting, and the rain gardens look wonderful. Next slide. But we're not going to stop there. So there's 2 additional projects now that have been funded by the Long Island Community Futures, the Long Island Futures Fund. These 2 projects together will address 50% of the stormwater entering into the subwatershed for Northport Harbor. And the modeling depicts that the subwatershed has about 144 pounds of nitrogen entering Northport Harbor annually. And these rain gardens combined will reduce the nitrogen going into the harbor by 50%. So we're actually pretty darn excited about this. Next slide. We're going to work on these projects this year. This is just a good visual. You can see this is the, again, roadway. Can't really see the slant, but the water literally races down. Northport's one of the few places we actually have hills on Long Island. So it races down these streets. This is what's there now with your photo to the left, which is nothing but the tree. We love the tree, don't get me wrong, but it's not enough to absorb all of the stormwater runoff that goes down. Next. And then this is the second rain garden that we're going to be doing. This is called the James Street Pocket Park. Look at this. The road ends. There's the harbor. The water goes right over the board. It doesn't actually go over the boardwalk there. That little boardwalk, it's so eroded and decrepit. The water goes right from the culvert in under the boardwalk, over the grass, right into the harbor, and it literally rushes there with a pretty big force. So all of this now is going to be redone. The boardwalk will be rebuilt. there will be a rain garden there, which will stop the rushing of the water and will provide for the filtration of the nitrogen and phosphorus before it goes right into Northport Harbor there. So we'll keep you posted about that. We're pretty excited about it. Last thing I want to say, and I know someone put this in the chat. So we had, and we are not hawking a product. I want you to be very clear. We do not benefit if you buy Scott's. But this is a product on the market that Scott's and Miracle-Gro got together. And look, we criticize industry when they do the wrong thing, and we'd like to give them some kudos when they do the right thing. So you can see here, they have Love Lawns and Long Island. They crafted a special mix for Long Island. I think they should market it in other coastal water areas, not just Long Island. They call it mindful nutrition. You have to love the wording of the marketing campaign here. And it says crafted with waterways in mind. Well, what makes it different? Next slide. 50% slow release nitrogen and also less nitrogen and less phosphorus. I'm not going to go into the specifics, but the 50% slow release nitrogen does allow for greater absorption by grass and gardens, therefore less runoff into the waterway. So one significant thing that you can do as a homeowner or business or municipality is if you're going to use fertilizer, use the ones that are slow release and have less nitrogen. So for instance, next slide, the village of Patchogue called me last spring. And actually, just as a sidebar, this is a picture of the living shoreline in Patchogue that they did. So they don't use fertilizer on this, so it doesn't really apply, but I mean, it's there, so I'll just tell you what it is. It's actually underwater right now because we have so much coastal flooding going on. It's actually crazy. But they called and they were like, look, we want to be responsible. We'd like to use this new fertilizer that has 50%, that has a 50% slow release, but we can't find enough of it. So I called Scott's, hooked Scott's up with the village of Patchogue. They purchased a large quantity of it, 50 or 100 bags, they don't remember. And the village then is using that on their properties as opposed to higher levels of nitrogen by other products. So it's a good step by a municipality. It was easy for them to do. They just had to make a phone call and we worked everything out. And I'd like to give kudos to them and have that be an example for villages along Long Island Sound, you know, Port Jefferson Village, Bayville. I could go on, but I won't. This is a simple step. Now, you might be saying to yourself, oh, why did Scott's do that? Scott's didn't really do it out of the goodness of their hearts, but they were I shouldn't say that. It wasn't only out of the goodness of their hearts, but they were involved and engaged in a lot of very rigorous and intense meetings we had with the Nature Conservancy, Citizens Campaign for the Environment, and other entities to talk about how we need to reduce nitrogen. At the time, we were going to do a nitrogen reducing law in the state. The law didn't actually occur, but Scott's heard the message. They got it, they responded, and they crafted this new product, showing that an industry can pivot and change when they have the incentive to do so. Next slide. And the next one. So the only one thing I'm going to say here is good news also for all of you homeowners who love your lawns, as the vast majority of Connecticut and New York do. The grass seed that you choose matters. Next one. So go ahead, keep going. So for instance, there's good grasses and there's not so great grasses. Fescue grass is a cool season grass. It grows really good in Connecticut and Long Island. Grasses that you should not choose. Kentucky bluegrass. It's sold a lot here. And this may not be shocking to you, but that one grows really well in Kentucky, but it doesn't grow so well here. And you end up using more fertilizer and more pesticides, actually, to have a successful lawn with something like a Kentucky bluegrass, as opposed to one that grows easy here, like a fescue grass. So just to keep that in mind as you're either reseeding or replanting as the spring approaches, not soon enough, but it'll be coming soon. So I'm going to end it there and say thank you so much for joining us. Those are some examples of what is happening that's productive, constructive, whether it's on the individual level, the municipal level, or really the state level. Thank you so much, everyone.
Nice. Thank you, Adrienne. And thank you to the other speakers as well. Lots of great information. I've been keeping an eye on the chat, and it looks like Heather, Betsy, and Margaret, you've had a lot of great questions that have come in. I think a few of those have been answered already. A couple others that popped up before we get into maybe more open discussion, or this is open discussion, but is this fertilizer, Adrienne, I think this is to you because I actually don't know the answer. Is this fertilizer available in Westchester County? Do you have an answer to that one?
You know, it is not, but actually we're going to be meeting with Scott's and ask him to do that. That's a great question. Honestly, I have to just tell you, I don't understand why they don't.
Yeah.
And I don't pretend to be a market person for a major business, but I really do think it would sell in Westchester, sell in Connecticut. We told them, why aren't you doing this in Florida, for goodness sake? So you could market it as an Everglades, product. And so many other areas. So it should be in Westchester. To the best of my knowledge, it's not yet in Westchester.
All right, great. Thank you. And then just sticking with you, Adrienne, because there was a couple in a row that are going to be for you. Can you talk a little bit about the cost differential? Are you paying to play to be more environmentally conscious, or is it pretty similar?
I think it's very similar. I haven't looked at it recently, but when we did look at it a couple years ago, it was like almost the same thing. It's not the same price as the no-name brand fertilizer, as we'll say, but it's very similar to the other Scott's products. Like, they didn't put a premium on it. I think they just want to sell it.
Right. Thanks, Adrienne. Jamie, maybe one that's kind of, I saw it get answered partially, but then maybe we could talk a little bit more about it. It had to do with like the percentage impacts of nitrogen and septic and those. And I think actually you did address that pretty well, but did you want to talk a little bit more about sort of like the modeling, the nitrogen load sourcing, anything else you can elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, so in the original nitrogen loading model that my lab and colleagues did, we did look at, the percent that was coming from human waste, whether it was septic or sewer, fertilizer applied to lawns, fertilizer applied to playing fields and agriculture, and then atmospheric deposition and where that was falling and kind of the stormwater impact. In our original model, we identified fertilizer as something that we just didn't know enough about. It was, there was a lot of error on that. And that led to this, I won't say led to, but it dovetailed nicely with the work that Rob was doing and his team was doing on assessing how much fertilizer was being put onto our landscape. So this new project that we're working on, we're largely billing it. We largely focus on that fertilizer link with the NSYNC model and the nitrogen loading model. But one of the outcomes will be kind of a vast improvement in that nitrogen loading model, because it'll now be coupled with NSYNC, which is more of a surface water transport model that does a much better job than the original nitrogen loading model. We have the new fertilizer data. And so from all of that, we'll be able to provide information on an embayment watershed scale like we did before, but now digging even a little deeper into each of those watersheds. So, if you're in Oyster Bay, we won't just be able to say, oh, in Oyster Bay, 30% is from fertilizer. Instead, we'll be able to look at neighborhoods and say, oh, in this neighborhood, you're dealing with a lot of fertilizer. And in this neighborhood over here, septic systems are your issue. So that will be one of the outcomes of this model. Although, again, we're focused primarily on that lawn fertilizer piece and what we can learn about it. But it'll be one of the side benefits is you'll be able to say, okay, let's not worry about fertilizer over here because they're dealing with septic and they have very little lawn. So let's focus on septic or sewer or whatever their issue is. And again, more broadly, help us target our mitigation strategies.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. That was helpful. That was good. Extra info on that one for Betsy, I think, had that question. Hannah, you're right there, so don't think you're forgotten here at all. I'm curious, can you give a little bit more or provide some more insight, like examples of how the coalition and some of the perspectives that they had shaped the project that you were leading?
Yeah. Well, I think that the coalition, they were obviously really vital in finding those words and phrases that they might find objectionable. And I can go into a little bit more detail about how we found that if you'd like. But I think the most tangible influence the coalition had on our project was the list of goals we set to inspire homeowners to act on. It's quite challenging to find the middle ground between feasible and impactful. You know, if we suggest something too challenging, it's going to be very easy to ignore. But if we suggest something too easy, then it might not be impactful enough to matter. So having perspectives from this diverse group of coalition members that range from people who hire out all of their lawn care activities and all the way to people who choose to do all of it themselves, it helped us choose impactful and meaningful actions that were also achievable.
Nice. Thank you. Adrian, I just saw your response and I responded to that question as well about the improvements to Northport Harbor based on some of these projects that are happening. And you and I should touch base because I think you know this, but Carolyn and Michael, Cornell Cooperative are collecting abundant environmental health data in Northport Harbor, including a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus data. So whatever you're all doing in terms of that data collection, maybe what we're doing, it could complement it. And it kind of made me think a bit about what some of these groups have talked about, and that's, you know, we're doing these projects, how quick are we going to see the response, right? Like, and there's not a silver bullet to that question. So if anyone wanted to jump on it, great. But you know, there's a lot of talk about how long nitrogen, for example, takes when it gets in the groundwater on Long Island, and how long does it take to actually get to the coast, depending on where you are on Long Island. And if you're talking about stormwater surface reduction compared to fertilizer reduction, you know, what are some of the experiences you've all had in the time that nitrogen is reduced to when you start seeing improvements? I mean, there's some pretty classic examples like Mumford Cove in Connecticut, but please, I'll open it up to all three of you for that. Jamie might talk about Mumford Cove.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you said, Mumford Cove is a great example because it's clear cut. You know, what happened in Mumford Cove is there was a wastewater treatment outfall coming into the cove. It's a tiny cove. The outfall was going into a freshwater stream that fed into the cove. They diverted that, and within 15 years, eelgrass had returned to the system. Within 1 year, actually less than a year, they diverted it in October. By the following May, the seaweed bloom was gone. Like, it was just piles of ulva, the sea lettuce on the beach, rotting and stinking. By the next spring, that was gone. Within 15 years, eelgrass had returned to the bay. Of course, there was a source of seeds just outside of Mumford Cove of eelgrass seeds, so it was continually being reseeded each year. So it really is a nice clear-cut example where if we can shut off the nitrogen load, essentially just flip a switch, then it takes 15 years to get full recovery. We can't flip off the switch in many places. So the response is often slower. You know, if we're reducing a nitrogen load by half, well, we're going to get, I won't say half the response because it's not linear, but it can take much longer than people think it should.
Yeah. Anyone else want to touch up on that one? Speakers?
Well, I think the question is, what benefit would we see? Was that your original question, Peter?
Yeah, so when you start cutting back the excess nitrogen, how quick will we? Oh, yeah, sure. Take it away with that, Adrian. What benefits would we see?
Well, let's just use Northport Harbor. We could use any harbor though. What we're seeing is with these toxic tides, whether it's brown tide or red tide or orange tide, now we have pink tide, we have mahogany tide. We're hoping for less toxic tides, which means shellfish beds would be reopened or restored. It also means now if we have less toxic tides, we can replant shellfish beds, which means we can have cleaner waters, and less beach closings, or less beach clothing, whichever you want. So, for instance, in Northport, the beach there was closed to bathing for 12 years straight. And then we upgraded the outfall pipe of the sewage treatment plant. Literally the next year, the beach was reopened. And since we've been doing the stormwater work and upgrading for the sewage treatment plant outfall pipe, we've had, I think, only 1 or 2 years where we had high levels of red tide instead of 8 consecutive years that we had prior to that. So we really will see and do see improved water quality, sometimes pretty quickly, but also it takes time for nature to heal itself. As Jamie said, it's not linear and it doesn't happen instantaneously, but it does happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Adrian. Jamie, I see your hand up. I got a couple of good questions from, I hope I don't get your name wrong, Tamara, but go ahead. And if you wanted to add quickly to that.
A quick response to what Adrian said. I think Adrian kind of highlighted that the response is going to vary based on the problems in that system. We can't set a target and say we want eelgrass everywhere. Eelgrass should not be everywhere. It doesn't occur everywhere. So recognizing that we have to be able to identify, is it a reduction in red tides, less hypoxia, less fish kills, more beach days? I think not getting hemmed in by, we have to have this metric met to achieve success, but recognizing that there are many indicators of success is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Jamie. A couple of good questions here, but they're both from.
Want to make sure we stay on time too, Peter. So let's wrap up with one more question, and then it's just we're getting close to the end.
Yeah. Okay. So follow up with us, Samir. There was some discussion about monitoring nitrate in the water, and I think that answer could take up the rest of the time. But these things take up nitrate pretty quickly. So there's other things that you can monitor in the water that can demonstrate, eutrophic condition or excess nitrogen in the water. So follow up with us after this webinar, and Jamie will probably write you a nice full 1-pager on things you could do. And I could certainly send our procedures over on some of the work we do that doesn't involve straight nitrate monitoring. And then also curious about eelgrass restoration and all of this versus issues of water clarity. And I mean, they're really related. Maybe I can answer this really quickly. I mean, if you're going to have eelgrass restoration projects, you have to have water that can support the eelgrass. So water clarity, light attenuation factors, things like that really do come into play. But we are going to be running out of time. So any other questions that anyone had, you're more than welcome to send them to us. You could drop them in the chat in the next 2 minutes and we'll save them. And we will get back to you with those. And I just want to wrap up by saying thank you to everybody. Don't everyone leave right now. I know that happens when someone says, I want to wrap up with, and then half the audience leaves. We have a quick exit poll that we'd like to post. So please go ahead and put that exit poll up. Maureen or someone from CCE, please. And as that's going up, I just want to bring up that we also have, the network will be offering a spring roundtable, kind of getting more ideas and concepts for things and ideas that we can bring to the network and speakers, et cetera. And we're also going to be highlighting Plastic Free July. That'll be our next webinar in July, focused on plastics, and that'll just be the main topic. So stay tuned. And I do want to make a pitch that if you're here, but you haven't signed up to our newsletter yet, there's a chance that we're not counting you as part of our coalition and part of like the group. So please, if you haven't signed up to our newsletter, the Coastal Watershed Network newsletter, please do, and then we'll make sure that you're documented. We can get you all this great follow-up information. And here's the poll. Thank you very much for joining. And now half the group can take off if you want. Have a great day, but do the poll first, please. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Happy
Thank you.
2024.